Well, thank you very much for having me up here, and good afternoon. Oh yeah, I've got you well doctrinated. You're half awake. Is there any chance to get that front bank of lights killed, Lori, just so for the slides? So I really wanted that rotation question, right? Like, what a great question. We'd put manure on every frickin' chance we had, and we'd grow oats. I'd make you all broke. But we'd grow oats in the rotation, because it's awesome. And come on, Megan, you gotta say, get those stupid soybeans out of there and grow edible beans. Like, just replace the soybeans with edible beans because they're way more profitable. Of course, if everybody in the room grew edible beans, they wouldn't be more profitable anymore. But anyway, that could have just been a whole lot of fun, that question. So, yeah. We're going to talk about compaction, and you'll notice that Alex Berry is on this slide as well. Alex and I have been working together on this presentation, and he's been really a keen part of it. He's with OMAFRA, the resource management. No, that's not what they're called anymore. Anyway, he's an engineer with them. And for those of you who don't know who I am or how to get a hold of me, there's all my contact information, and you're welcome to email me or call me or tweet me. How many guys are we making any progress? How many guys on Twitter? Yeah, a little bit of progress. It's interesting, right, that Megan got asked about the canola soybean question, and she's 100% right that the harvest timing is all bad. The canola almost for sure is going to shatter before the soybeans are ready to harvest. It's just going to be a challenge. But out west, they're growing peas and canola together on purpose. It's called peola. Seriously, you laugh. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. And the two together actually give more yield than either one by itself. So it's, that concept is really kind of interesting. The main researcher, the lead researcher that is doing all this work, a doctor out of the University of Saskatchewan, says that she gets most of her information off Twitter. Because the innovative farmers, it's the innovators that are doing it, they think they had 100,000 acres of this intercropping last year. And it's not just peas and canola, they're also looking at flax and I think lentils together. Like, there's a whole range of things that they're looking at from that standpoint. It's cool stuff, but Twitter's, because that's where all the innovators live. Now, don't believe everything you hear on Twitter, but if you're not on Twitter, it's such an agricultural tool. Enough on that. Okay, so I will just quickly, some shameless self-promotion. I do work with Real Agriculture, and I do my weekly podcast there called Wheat Pete's Word. You can get it off the website. You can call that number and get it as well if you're not a webhead. But we're also on radio now. I think I mentioned that last year. We've been on radio now for about 14 months. It's really cool. So the rest of the world now knows that there is agriculture north of the 49th parallel. It's not all just agriculture in the United States of America. And that's neat. So I now get questions on the word from the country of Georgia. Not the state of Georgia, the country of Georgia, over a former Soviet country. I get them from Idaho. It's really quite global, and it's really neat. It's also very challenging because the answer to the guy in Georgia might well be different than the answer to the guy in Ontario, because just a few differences there, but that's kind of fun. Okay, let's go on compaction. What happened, or where did this come out of? And it really came out of the Compaction Action Day on September the 7th, and this was an initiative of the Innovative Farmers Association. I was lucky enough that they asked me to help out in terms of facilitating that day, and it was an incredible day, an absolutely incredible day. So full credit to Innovative Farmers for kicking this off. They brought a chap over from Switzerland, Matthias Stettler, and he is the compaction guru. And he knows, or I shouldn't say he knows, that the Europeans are way ahead of us in terms of compaction. They've been looking at compaction now for at least 5, if not 10 years, as a major yield factor. And we all say, yeah, compaction hurts us, but we don't really take it very seriously. They've been taking it seriously, trying to figure the thing out. And so a bunch of other people that really made it work. Jake Cranbrink was a key player in terms of getting Matthias there. Daryl Burnett, Kerry James from Innovative Farmers, Ian McDonald from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. I don't have up there Sean Schill, but he was the host farmer. Just a whole team of people. And so we managed, as a group, to run 35 pieces of equipment over the sensor with 53 different configurations, the largest compaction day ever that Matthias had been part of. And so we had combines, well, maybe not combines, we had different pieces of equipment with bias ply tires on one side and radials on the other side, right? With narrow radials on one side or duals and a single tire on the other side. So we did all of that stuff to look at those comparisons. And I think that's really a whole lot of fun. So this is what it looked like. We're running over the sensor there. You'll see more of this in a minute. And here comes the silage wagon loaded with wheat. It's a dump wagon we loaded with wheat. Because if farmers can do it, they will. And you can see that we were creating a certain amount of compaction, right? So, we really want to start quickly with what is compaction, what is soil compaction, and I think that looks like pretty good soil compaction. It's stirring, yeah, it's stirring. I don't know, anyway. So, you know, it's really, I had a grower this morning, I spoke at Oxford Soil and Crop this morning, and a grower said, so how do we measure compaction in our own field? How do we tell? Holy crow, it's really tough, right? And so I don't have a good answer for that. But what they're doing now to figure out or to show compaction better is that we've turned to the medical field. And so you go to the hospital and you get an MRI. What's an MRI? It's computer tomography. And so we now take soil and we do the exact same thing. We use computer tomography, and what we look at is the amount of pore space. So that's the amount of pore space in green. And then after we drive over, this is a 30-ton manure slurry tanker with 4 axles, ran over that, shrank it down, and that's the pore space that is left, right? And so that's what compaction does, full stop. It reduces the amount of pore space. And all sorts of things can cause compaction. It doesn't have to be wheel traffic. In fact, they estimate that when the hurricane went through Houston, that Houston, in the worst waterlogged areas, sank 4 inches. That there was enough water weight that it actually sank. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. I've never seen science, but water can compact as well, so there's lots of things that can cause that. So what is the ideal soil? And I think most of you know this, but the ideal soil, the topsoil, 25% air, 25% water, and 5% organic matter on a silt. We'd like to see more than that on a clay. A sand is a little bit less. And the mineral portion is about 45%. The subsoil component, because this is another component that we're not paying enough attention to, you just take the organic matter out. So we're 50% solids, 50% pore space. Half the pore space full of water and half the pore space full of air. And, you know, if you get to that, we call that field capacity, where we're half air, half water. That's when it generally works right. And if more of the pore space than half of the pore space is filled with water, it's too wet to work. And if you get less than that filled with water, then it's getting on the dry side, and it works really, really well. So that's kind of, you know, where we want to be. It doesn't take much, right? You compact about 6% of that out, and all of a sudden we get into this situation, and we have a way more mineral component, and we have far less pore space that's filled with both air and water. And it happens in the subsoil as well, right? So lots of times when you're out there in the spring and you think that, gosh, I'm at the perfect component, you know, things are working excellent in the topsoil because it's dry enough, this subsoil is often pretty wet, and you drive over it with big equipment, and we end up getting a lot of compaction down in that subsoil. So I find this really intriguing. This is out of the Peace River District. And there's a chap up there by the name of Jason Castleman who I talk to fairly frequently. And so this just shows me how important winter is to us. So in the fall of 2016 in the Peace River District, it was wet, and they did not get their canola harvested. So they went out in the spring and they harvested 5 bushel per acre canola. So all that was left, right? And they planted peas after the canola, and they went through and tried to take the tracks out with a track remover. I didn't put that picture in, and that is what the peas looked like. Where the guys got the canola combined in the fall, they got 40 bushel canola or 35 bushel canola. Peace River District actually goes really good canola, and they didn't see that. So that impact of the winter conditions, the freeze-thaw and the wet-dry, has huge implications. And you can say, well, this never happens in Ontario. You're absolutely wrong. And I wish I'd taken pictures, but back about 15 years ago, I was combining corn. I'm always late. It got to be December the 4th or something, and it snowed. And suddenly I was able to go out and run on the snow, and the wheels stayed clean, and, the old four-wheel drive white wasn't making much of a mess. And the snow stayed all winter so that compaction didn't get much to work on it. And the soybeans, I could see every combine track. And let me tell you, when you have a 4-row corn head, every stinking tire track. So it's really intriguing how much impact that has. So there's what it looked like in the spring, right? This is what it looked like after he combined it. Would you say that that's much compaction? That doesn't look bad to me. By the way, he's using a tracked combine, 36-inch wide tracks, and pretty decent-sized rear tires. And yet everywhere, and that's actually a turnout with the sprayer, where he turned out in the spring, and it just really, really has. So how much impact does that have? So there's a ton of research around, and it doesn't matter where you go. But in terms of, and I find this, I really am starting to try to put this story together because, I'm a no-till guy, and I'm struggling on the no-till front to keep you guys. There's more and more tillage all the time. And I'm wondering, why is that? So here's some really interesting data, and this is European data, but there's Pennsylvania data that says almost the same thing. So we compacted it here, and it's 1 pass over the field. Now, they compacted every inch of the field, so, but again, it was about, I think this one was a 25-ton manure spreader, and they compacted it, so a pretty good compaction. And where we didn't compact it, here is the yield with tillage. So lots of guys, they want to go out there and they compact with the grain buggy, and so get that deep ripper and just blow black smoke like there was no tomorrow. Right? Yeehaw, take that compaction out. Well, even when they did that, so they did their absolute best, and they still lost 20% in yield the first year in canola and 10 or 11% in corn yield. So still a pretty big, that's the, that's triticale the first year and corn the second year. So it came back, with tillage it came back, we lost 20% the first year, 10% the second year. The thing about no-till, this is the without tillage portion, the first year, look at how much we got beat up. So, we're down here at about 10% yield. In the Pennsylvania data, the first year after compaction in a no-till situation, the crop yielded 2% of the uncompacted. And you guys in your stinking bloody combines with those Quonset huts up on the top of them, and now they're 1,500 bushel grain buggies. The B train doesn't hold as much as the buggy anymore. And we wonder why we're suffering from a no-till perspective. I really think that there's something here. Now, I will say that in the Pennsylvania data, that they clearly showed that you till the soil, and it is far more prone to compact. So it will compact way tighter than a no-till soil. So what does that mean? that means the custom operators all go out and combine on the conventional tillage till they get stuck, and then they go combine on the no-till because they don't get stuck there, and of course that doesn't compact at all, right? It's bizarre. But so the other thing that is true in both Pennsylvania and this data is look at how much more quickly the no-till bounced back. So it still didn't achieve that yield, but same thing happened. In a conventional tillage in Ohio, it took them about 8 years for that compaction to come back. In the no-till, if I remember the data right, it was about 3 years for it to come back. So much quicker rebound, but a really big impact from that standpoint. So then you say, well, yeah, and I actually had this question this morning, drove me nuts. The guy said, yeah, but come on, Johnson, we don't compact every inch of every field. Well, this is Ohio data from Scott Shearer, and you know, how much compaction, a 16-row combine. I mean, you talk about my 4-row combine, I compact a lot of acres, right? Because it's got a little 10, but a 16-row combine, I'm 40 feet wide, and yeah, I probably have duals on it, but when you look at the data, I compact 17% of the area. Now, does the combine always travel in the same track? And the answer is absolutely not. And the grain buggy tracks another 14%. So between the grain buggy and the combine, I've tracked 30% of the soil. And I don't compact the same acre every year. Do you ever wonder, why is it that right along the fence row, we often see that right along the fence row, the crop is better, right? That first 10 feet in, or whatever that number is. Do you know how hard it is to get great big stinking equipment right along the fence row? The equipment's too wide. We can't, and there's just something going on there. So this means that, yes, over a series of years, and by the way, if you're hauling manure with a tanker, it would only take about 2 years of a series, and you've compacted every inch. So it's a much bigger problem than what we've given it credit for. You say, so, okay, how much impact does it have? This one I find really intriguing, this European data. So they're just running equipment that compacts the surface. It's not got heavy axle loads. It's light axle loads, but high pressure in the tires. We're just compacting the soil surface. We do it year after year after year, and you can quite clearly see that every year we lose about 3% in yield. And it just keeps, they only went for 7 years, and maybe it levels off about a 20% yield loss. They didn't go beyond that. But it's cumulative. That yield keeps going down with just surface soil compaction. Then you look at the subsoil compaction, and this is this just is astounding to me. One compaction event where we compacted the subsoil at 0. The first year we lost, 17% in yield, and yeah, year 2 it came back. But notice that it almost never, even after 12 years, we had 1 year where we did not see yield loss, and that was probably the perfect year weather-wise. So that's one compaction event in the subsoil. That's not every stinking year with your blasted big combine. So it's really, so then you say, what's the impact? Well, why are we splitting tile? And my answer is that a large part of splitting tile is 30 years of great big equipment that's compacting the subsoil. And what we've done is, I showed you that first slide with the porosity. What's the porosity allow for? It allows for water movement. We put tile in on 50-foot centers or whatever it was. In 1972, they tiled my home farm. They put them in at 50-foot centers. And the thing drained awesome. The guys could get out there early. It worked no issue. In 2016, even with a stinking light white combine that, only has a 150 bushel bin, not 400 bushel the way you have now, I split tile. It's now at 25 feet. And you can say, yeah, but Peter, that's because we're trying to plant earlier all the time. It is, absolutely. But you could clearly see that where the tile runs were, it was drier earlier, and the water movement, that lateral water movement, was no longer happening to the tile. So we split tile. And so my concern is, now I got them in at 25 feet, and I think it's working okay, but if I keep beating the daylights out of it and, hiring my neighbor to come in and every once in a while with his manure well, actually don't hire him, I trade manure for straw. That's a whole other issue. The way he spreads manure, he should never be allowed on the property. But anyway, he's got great big equipment. If I keep doing that, 20 years from now, I'll split the 25s down to 12 and a half. Where does it stop? So it's just something that I think has way more impact. So this is kind of an interesting, this is Pennsylvania data, and they're effectively saying that, the yield loss to topsoil compaction, if we compact, we start out about 15% yield loss. The topsoil component goes away fairly quickly. The shallow subsoil compaction goes away fairly quickly, but that deep subsoil compaction, lower subsoil compaction, they would say it never goes away. And that's pretty scary stuff when you start thinking of this. So one last slide that I'll throw in, because I think there's a few growers in here that grow hay, and I found this really intriguing, kind of fun, eh? So what it is just, they were talking about compaction, and then for whatever reason they got talking wheel traffic on alfalfa. But the black bars are the yield loss where we traveled the alfalfa field after 5 days after harvest, and the white bars are the alfalfa yield loss where we tracked it 2 days after harvest. And they were calling that somewhat compaction related. I think it's just all tramp damage, to be quite honest. But I really have never seen that before, that we could get 25% yield loss by tracking an alfalfa field 5 days after we took it off. And by the way, when you do traffic an alfalfa field, right? When you do that, what's the conditions? It's done raining, I got 3 days, go cut hay. Right? That's what you do. You guys all think that alfalfa reduces compaction. Lord, to help us with the equipment we have now, it's probably the worst. So we start off about here. So I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff, and we're going to get right into the data here, but just realize that, and I don't want to get too much into this, Andrew likes this stuff, he's an engineer. Anyway, all it says is that you put a force on it, something has to give. That's all it says. And I want you to remember, because some of the data, a lot of it's European data, it's all our data, but their software puts it all into bars, and so we didn't get it all shifted over into PSI. So just remember that 1 bar is 14.5 PSI. So this is still, again, we're Canadians, right? So 14.5 PSI is not the metric system, thank you very much. We're still back with the Brits and the Yanks on that one. The 1 bar is the metric system, so that's those two numbers you want to keep in the back of your head. And everything's a spring. So you drive over it, and if the spring compacts and bounces back up, life is good. When you put enough load on it that the spring compresses and it doesn't bounce back, that's when the problem starts. So I find this pretty interesting as well, and I don't want to, I know I get into too much data, but a light soil, we always think that a light soil can't compact, but a light soil actually compacts worse than a heavy soil when both are dry. And it's a function of moisture. And moisture is essentially the grease between the particles. That's what makes things move. And heavy soils tend to be wet soils, and so that's why they're more compaction prone. They're wet. If you get a dry clay, I have clay on my farm. I swear when it's dry, you can land a 747 and never make a mark. She's just like that. But when it's wet, it's all bad. So it really is kind of a function of that. And the other thing that I find really interesting, and I know you had a soil health speaker, but boy, soil strength is really related to organic matter as well. And so you want a strong soil that will resist compaction. You want 1% organic matter for every 5% clay in the soil. And what have we done to our organic matter levels in the past 50 years? Exactly. So most of us, and maybe Grey Bruce is better because you guys were in pasture longer, and so maybe you're not quite to the point where we are. But in my part of the world, we are at about 40% of the original organic matter. We were 9% when we started. We're down to about 4%. And so when you look at how that soil resists compaction, the more we take that organic matter away, the more it's susceptible to that compaction. So the other thing that I want you to remember, and these are just numbers that we kind of use as typical targets, 14.5 PSI is we don't want to exceed that stress. For topsoil, 7.5 psi, which will line up with 1 bar and half a bar for the subsoil. If we get to those stress levels, then we know we're creating compaction. And it's not a magic line in the sand. It's really not. It depends on soil moisture and soil type and a whole bunch of things. But those are numbers that we sort of use as targets. So the wetter the soil is, the deeper it goes, and the heavier the equipment is, the higher the tire pressure. All of those things make an impact. The title of the presentation was Conquering Compaction. That's how you do it. You also really help employment possibilities, right? So it is, yeah. Anyway, and by the way, if one breaks down, it's okay because there's just pull the guy. But so what did we do at Compaction Action? What we did was look at 3 different depths. And so we did 6 inches, 12 inches, and 20 inches. And so topsoil is 6 inches, 12 inches is the upper layer of subsoil, 20 inches is the deep or the drainage component, if you will. And what we did was we used this to put in these probes. Okay, so by the way, tough to drill through steel? Try drilling into soil. I'm serious. I couldn't believe you would think that you could take that drill and drill, we dug the pit, drill. My word, we had young, big guys leaning on that drill for all they were worth, and then once the drill got in, do you think you could pull that sucker out? Like, it is bizarre how tough that is, just bizarre. So we put in these probes, these are the probes here, and so what they look like is this. It's called a bowling probe, and this is all filled with water. This is connected to the computer, and this rubber tube here flexes, right? So it's all filled with water. When there's pressure, this gets squeezed, which increases the pressure in here. That reads to the computer, and we can figure out how much compaction we actually are getting. We dig a pit in the soil, we drill into the soil, and we insert one of the bowling probes. That's how it's done. That makes it look pretty simple. We do it at 3 depths, 6, 12, and 20. The other thing that we did, because we wanted to look at maximum concern or maximum issue, maximum risk, everything was fully loaded. So I mentioned that first slide the guy went over was a silage dump wagon. They loaded with wheat. Every combine was full. Every grain buggy was full. Every manure tanker was full. So maximum risk. And then everything was weighed. That's why it took such a massive team. So needed pad scales, weighed every axle, or if it was duals, weighed both tires on the duals. So we knew the weight, and we calculated what speed it would go, whether it was road speed or field speed, because that makes a difference. And then we set the tire pressure based on those things. So we're going to look at a fair few graphs. And we're not going to look at them all, but I'll show you enough to kind of get your brain around what we saw that will impact maybe how you farm. And don't get too hung up on the colors. There's one of the things about this software is the software decides what color is going to go where. And so normally you should say, well, the green line is always the surface soil compaction level. But the top line is always the surface, and the middle line is always the 12-inch depth, and the bottom line is always the 20-inch depth, because you don't get more compaction at 20 inches than you do at 6, right? But the colors may change a little bit. And then you just look at the compaction level here, and remember we talked about 1 bar, and we talked about half a bar. And so when you look at that, my surface soil, this particular, I'm almost creating a problem in the surface soil, and if I look at half a bar, I'm very close as well, right? So we looked at different equipment, and so the sensor location is here. We drive over it at about 1 mile an hour, and by the way, if we drove over it faster, we would get less compaction, right? Because you have less time of contact. But it's pretty tough at 10 mile an hour to do some jobs. Plus, when you're trying to just get exactly over the middle of the sensor and somebody's trying to direct you, then going slow is a better thing. We weighed things. We have them all set, and you'll see that as it comes up on the screen. So this is a tractor that we drove over. And when we did that, on the single side, we have 13 psi in the fronts, 12 psi in the backs, and that's actually the first picture that you saw with 3,300 kilograms, 4,500 kilograms, and that shows you that the tractor alone, with single tires on it, with no equipment, because if we hooked that thing onto something with some drawbar weight, what would happen to that number? Right, it's going to go up. So what's going to happen to our compaction? It's going to go up. So this is just the tractor, and we are just at the threshold of causing some issue. So then we say, okay, what happens when we put duals on? And so we look at duals on the other side, and we run the duals. Now we're at 9 psi. This, on the singles, this was 13, that was 12. Now we're at 9 psi front and rear, and the scale is a little different. That's half a bar, so we're in pretty good shape from a compaction standpoint, right? So that just shows you have more. But when I put the two side by side and make the scale the same, the rest of the graphs will get the scale the same without making it look like this. But do the duals help? Of course they help. They also, though, when you think about this, if I added something on behind and I have duals on, what percentage of the field do I traffic versus singles? So there's always this kind of trade-off between how much do I traffic versus how much compaction do I get in a specific area. So that's kind of intriguing as well. So anyway, the duals are doing better. So now we're going to start looking at some fun stuff. Here's a manure tanker. I'm pretty sure this was a 5,000 gallon manure tanker. 40 psi at road speed, 15 psi at field speed. So this had the capability, we ran it over once at 40 psi, dropped the tire pressure down to 15 psi as if we're in the field to look at the difference in compaction. And so there's the two graphs. So notice, by the way, we missed the tractor, right? Couldn't get the tractor over the sensor as well as the manure spreader. And when we look at that, so the X's are because that's the tractor and it doesn't mean anything. It's really tough to see, and I apologize for that. It's tough to get the scale, but that's why we blew them up. And so when I'm on the road, here's my road, I'm essentially compacting everything. Oh, $50. Whose phone is that? It's a $50 donation to 4-H, right? That's the rule. $50 donation to 4-H when your phone rings in a meeting.
That's a lot of inflation since you retired.
What's that?
That's a lot of inflation since you retired. It used to be 20.
So thanks, Tim. There's not that long ago that I stood at the front of the meeting. I'd rushed in, I had no time, and I was at the front of the meeting, and my phone rang. And you know what they said? $100. You're the speaker, it's double, $100. Anyway, so this, this is really intriguing. So, there's a whole bunch of things that immediately should go through your head. Like, not only are we compacting when we're here, what's the critical level? 14 and a half pounds or 1 bar in the surface soil. What am I up to? 1.7 bar. So it's not just a little compaction, it's tremendous compaction. And then you look at the subsoil compaction, and what's the critical level? Half a bar. And so here, holy Lord, we're double. And even at the 20-inch, we're calling this the drainage, at 20 inches, we're still causing very significant compaction. You want to go down the road with a manure tanker, you get to the field, you pull into that field, you have trouble, full stop. When we lower the pressure as much as we can, we still are just barely there, right? That's at 1.05 bar, so it's just over the threshold. We're very close to threshold here, but our deep compaction, at least, we have solved some of that, right? So that's a win. Look at bias ply versus radial tires. And so this is where it kind of gets interesting. I hope you're all on radial tires because we know they give a bigger footprint and we know that we can run reduced pressures and that's all good. And you can see that clearly, and most of the time what we see in this is that The red line here is the deep compaction, and it doesn't matter whether I'm running bias ply or radial. This is a big square baler on them. My deep compaction is about the same. It's just the surface compaction that lower pressure radial tire can help. And it does help because it takes it from over critical level, 15 psi, to well below, so we're down about 12 psi. So we gain from those radial tires, but the deep compaction hasn't changed that much. So let's look at combines, because we have lots of questions about combines. How do I get away from compaction on combines? So we're really fortunate that Sean has essentially the same combines. He has 4 of them. 3 of them are set up on duals. One of them, by the way, was set up on tracks, and he took the tracks off, and that's an interesting story, and went back to duals. 1 combine on big singles. So they're effectively the same combine, same weight, and we ran 1 dual, and of course, notice that when we run the duals, we miss the steering axle, right? We can't get the steering axle as well. But on the big single, we get both, and there's the comparison. What do you think? So this is the rear tire, that's the front tire on the big singles, and here's my front tire in the duals, and we miss the rear. Somebody's got to say something. So the big single is better in terms of surface compaction, absolutely. And why is it better? Because it has more, and actually Matthias from Switzerland said, wow, I would not have predicted that. That big single is giving me less compaction than the duals. And everybody was kind of surprised at that. The subsoil, is a little bit less, but close to the same. The deep compaction, they're both still too much. And by the way, if you look here or you look here, the deep compaction is exactly the same because the weight is the same. So you can reduce your surface compaction by controlling your air pressure, but it generally doesn't reduce subsurface compaction very much. It's strictly an axle load issue. The other thing that really jumps out at you here, though, is look at that back tire. Right through the roof. And so the immediate thought is, wow, we do not have enough rubber on the back steering axle. Yeah, question? Is
that 20 pounds in the duals and only 17 in the single?
Yes, 20 pounds in the duals.
Why can't you get those duals down to about 12?
So everything was weighed, and the air pressure was put in the tires to the manufacturer's specification for that weight. So these big singles, by the way, are CFO radials, so they are the latest technology. And with radials, it's all about the amount of air in the tire. And so we could get way more air in that one big single to carry that than we could in the 2 duals. Now, if you went to wider duals, you could have lowered that, absolutely. But the wider the duals you go, the more you track, right, of the field. So you could maybe equal it with better duals. I'm not arguing that. But this big single performed way better than what we expected it to. If this was a truck going down the highway, what would they do? If they're overloaded, what do? You add more axles, right? You add more axles. We don't think of doing that when we're in the field. That's not part of the thought process. It's totally different. So then we always get questions about tracks versus singles, or tracks versus tires. And so this is a Lexion combine. The other 2 are John Deere's. And we simply could, you can't take a John Deere combine and take tires off and put tracks on like that. But the weights are very, very close. So it's the closest comparison we can get. Notice, what do you see here with my tracks? Sorry? It's over a wider area. Why? It's longer, right? The track is longer. Every bogey wheel, back, front roller, bogey wheel, back roller. So when they talk about the track and this action, it's real. Every bogey wheel gives you that next spike. By the way, the new tracks that they're coming out with in Europe, because when we turn with tracks, we make a mess, right? And the longer the track, the bigger mess you make. So the new tracks, when you turn, the front and the back actually come up so that you get less on the ground, so when you turn, you don't make... It's true. You laugh, but it's true. It's kind of cool. Anyway, notice again, that back tire, we hit that back tire, big issue. I'm running out of time. When we took, by the way, so notice this one, we're at 20 PSI, that's with the header on. We thought, what the heck, what happens when we take the header off? We take the header off, wow. So balance is the other issue. And when you're looking at this kind of stuff, you take the header off, so now we don't have the counterweight on the front, it's loaded, we get lots more weight on the back axle. Same thing happens with a sprayer. You go to the field, you fold out, suddenly the dynamics are different. You got way more weight on the back axle. So, you look at big tracks versus singles. So there's my singles, there's my tracks. And you know, when people, and the colors have reversed, I apologize. But regardless, when you look at that, the deep compaction is effectively the same. There is essentially no difference. And the surface compaction is very similar. So when they ask you which is better, tracks versus singles, the answer is that tires can be just as good as tracks. Now don't forget though that the tracks are narrower than the big single. So in terms of the surface area I compact, the big single is going to compact more. The track gets it with length, the big single gets it with width. And so when we looked at that first slide where I had 14% compacted by the combine, I'd compact less percentage of the field with the tracks because it's a narrower profile, right? Anyway, cool stuff. So the answer is unload the bin. Just some other fun stuff, you know, we looked at all, and eventually, I don't know when, but eventually it will be up on Innovative Farmers' website, but you can see that, you know, an excavator, it's pretty soft, but look at every roller, eh? There's just every roller is hitting as the excavator goes across. There's a backhoe. And the backhoe, for those of you at the back wheel is over 20 PSI, so surface compaction is an issue. The subsurface is at about 14, and we don't want it over 7 or 8. So backhoes create a lot of compaction, just the way that the beast is built. So we can look at cyclic loading. I'm going to skip that. The other thing that you'll hear lots about is different tires. They're coming out with IF tires and VF tires. The problem with IF tires, so an IF tire will carry 20% more weight at the same pressure. A VF tire will carry 40% more weight at the same pressure. And this was the tire industry's original way to reduce compaction. We can carry more weight at lower pressure. The problem is they were really looking at it, so we want to be able to go fast on the road at the same pressure that we run in the field. But the technology doesn't get us far enough. And so what's really going to happen now are these new CTIS tires. So CTS stands for Central Tire Inflation System. And now, for the very first time, we have tires that are designed to work with on-the-go air pressure. That's its footprint in the road. That's its footprint in the field. And we really think that this is the way of the future. So you want to look at central tire inflation systems. You know, if you're hauling manure with a tanker, and you've got to set it on the road for road conditions, you will never get away from compaction, full stop, because it's too much weight on every axle. And everybody says central tire inflation. I talked a bit about this at, actually it was at SWAC, and the one guy in the audience said, oh yeah, so my neighbor has one of these, and do you know, with the Fendt tractor in front of it and the tandem manure tanker, do you know what that central tire inflation system cost? And I said, well, I don't know. What did it cost, Jasper? $1 million. Really? So a central tire inflation system that you can buy, that you can add on, is somewhere, depends on what you get, but $20,000 to $30,000. And right away everybody says it's too much money. I can't afford it. It's too much money. Well, wait a minute. Let's think about this for a minute. So the science from Matthias and from Europe And by the way, in Europe, all the big new tractors come standard with tire inflation systems. That's standard. And all the equipment has standard, and you just hook the thing up to the air pressure up to the tractor. So they're there. They've figured it out. Here, we're going to retrofit. Well, if you retrofit, you use 15% less fuel, because on the road, it actually rolls better at high pressure. In the field, it rolls better at low pressure, so you save 15% in fuel. And if you use it 1,000 hours, and I mean, you'd have to do your own math, but this is fair. 1,000 hours at around 5 gallons an hour, 20 liters an hour, you would save about $2,400 in fuel. You get 20% less tire wear. So your tires last 20% longer. And so when I do that on 4 tires, so this is a tractor with only 4 tires, I'm saving about $533 in tire wear. So when you put that together, you save almost $3,000 a year between fuel savings and less tire wear. If it costs me 30 grand, it's a 10-year payback, not looking at the compaction issue, not looking at what you're making up in compaction. So I do not understand why this technology has not taken off. I think we haven't been promoting it well enough. It's not the only way. Tracks, there's other ways, but certainly it's pretty important. So how many people in the room have actually gone and weighed their piece of equipment with the manure tanker unloaded so that they know what they have on every axle? Put up your hand. How many people actually do that? Oh, come on. Good for you, Adam. One hand in 200 people. Do you think you have a problem? The answer is absolutely. If you don't, you know what happens at the tire shop? And I'm not blaming those guys. I do the same thing. Tire shop comes in, they change the tire. What are they going to do? They're going to make sure they put enough air in the tire. They're not going to shortchange you. They don't want you going home thinking the thing's half flat. So if it should go to 18 pounds, they're going to pump it to 25 because life looks good. And the equipment dealers, they're getting better, but everybody needs to be educated in terms of what does it weigh, what's the tire pressure that I can go to. And all of that stuff can be figured out, but that's really quite important. There is no real best system. I think you have to look at many different things in terms of loads and the cost of things. They talk lots about flotation tires, and Alex really likes this. So, which is better job floating, a silage wagon with 580 flotation radials on it, or a golf cart with 580 flotation radials? So it makes a difference, right? It absolutely makes a difference. And we just did this little flotation tractor, and that's a nice small tractor with great big turf tires on it, and everything was good. So if you guys could just get back to all those little garden tractors in the field, we'd have no issues. So the other thing that I find is pretty interesting is the pickup truck. How much compaction? What do you think? So here it is. Here's the pickup truck empty. And, we're just about breaking all the rules. We're not quite, but we're very close. As soon as we go to loaded, we're creating significant compaction. And we actually create as much or more surface compaction than that manure tanker did with the 15 PSI. And that was 30 tons of manure, doing less compaction than my pickup truck. Now, not at deep depths. Deep depths is almost nothing because there's just the axle weight is quite low. But surface compaction, they do a lot of damage. How do you create or stop compaction? That's the way. And with that, questions? Yep.
Drag hose.
Yeah, so drag hose is absolutely better because I don't have the weight of the manure tanker on behind me. But when do you go out with a drag hose? When it's too wet. Thank you, Adam. And remember that very first slide I showed of the graphs, that was just the tractor. And that tractor alone, at pretty reasonable soil conditions, it wasn't super wet. And it was almost over the limit. So you want to see a problem? Go drag hose. When it's actually too wet to be out there, you'll still have a problem. Exactly. So drag hose is way better than a manure tanker for sure, but keep out of the field when it's too wet. Anything else?
Yeah, a question. You had the big square baler and a tractor on there. Did you ever run cows across that probe? Because I do intensively pasture my beef cattle at the same time, and they're out when it rains in that really wet ground. I'm just wondering how bad a full-grown beef cow would be compared to the tractor she had.
Yeah, and so my only comment would be, if you go back and look at the pickup truck, right, and it's terms of total weight. So that cow, when the hoof is, I don't know, 6 square inches or whatever that you would get on the ground, or less, 4 square inches, and the cow weighs 2,000 pounds, she's going to do some surface compaction. And when it's too wet, I bet you see that because you get all the hoof prints, right? And it's a brute to no-till into that, right? Like, it just doesn't work with it, doggone. But no, we did. It's incredibly tough to get the cow to be smart enough to step in the right spot. So no, we did not run any cows over it. But deep compaction would be nothing because she doesn't weigh enough, right? It's just surface compaction. Yes?
Peter, can you give us some thoughts on how frost would alleviate compaction problems?
How frost would mitigate compaction?
Minimize.
Minimize. So when the frost goes in the soil, it creates ice lenses, right? And when it creates ice lenses, it lifts the soil up and pushes it apart. And you've got to be really careful, because sometimes when that ice goes away, it's just like tillage, right? It's basically aerated the soil, and it's really prone to recompact if you drive over it when it's too wet. But if you can get roots that grow down through there and stabilize that zone before you compact it, then the ice will push that apart. Wet-dry cycles actually work better than freeze-thaw cycles, because if you think about, compaction or the number of times frost goes in and out, it's often not that many times. Depends on the year, but you go west, it's not very often. But wet-dry cycles, they make a big difference. So those wet-dry cycles also do the same thing. It's that shrinking and swelling that helps relieve the compaction problem. All right? Tim?
I appreciate you coming back, Peter, every year, even though we tend to abuse you sometimes. Couple things. One was something I saw in the Ontario Farmer recently from Agroteka. I think that's what it's called in Europe, the big equipment show. The Swarm corn planter.
Yep.
I don't know if you saw that or not.
Agrotechnica, absolutely, yep.
And the other thing was, as far as the pickup truck goes, and I've seen it myself, my sister and brother-in-law have sweet corn, and they use some of my land, rotating it around year to year. And their roadways, even though it's just a pickup truck, maybe a pickup truck and trailer, might go on the roadway a few times before they move across the patch. The last 3 years, I've seen those roadways the next year in my soybeans.
Yeah, and so the Swarm corn planter, I'll address that first. So Agrotechnica is the big show in Germany, and it's where all the new innovations are. And it's massive, right? I've never been, but Sean Haney, the guy that owns Real Ag, has been the last 2 years. And so the London Farm Show would be one building there, and they have, I think it's 30 buildings, and they'll have buildings that are dedicated to just cultivators or just tractors or like it's just amazing the amount of stuff that goes on there. So the Swarm corn planter is essentially a whole bunch of robotic one-row corn planters. And so if anything will solve compaction, it is autonomous vehicles. Because with autonomous vehicles, I truly think that we're going to go to smaller units. And by the way, anybody in this room, the young person coming up that loves, they're farming because they love to drive tractor. Sorry about your luck. So the Swarm, I think, works to plant, Tim. My big question is, 300 bushel corn, how do I do that and still not have, like that's, actually, I get asked about controlled traffic. Why isn't controlled traffic solve this? Well, controlled traffic solves this, but to make controlled traffic work, I need the widest possible header. So I need at least a 12 row, at least everything's at least 30 feet wide, and 40 feet wide is better. Man, in 300 bushel corn, or 250, or even, okay, I'm in Bruce County. So in 225 bushel corn, actually, I guess I'm in gray here, aren't I? Anyway, whatever. So I'm really, you get in a field that's 3,000 feet long or a mile long, Like how, the buggy is the problem, right? Getting the grain away from that combine is the problem. So controlled traffic works in places like Australia where they get 40 bushel wheat yield most of the time. And so the buggy makes it from one end to the other, and that's okay. Yeah, I don't know. In big yield country, it makes a whole lot more challenge. So I think you're right on the planter side, and tillage and all that stuff. I think harvest is a bit more of a challenge. I'm not sure how we make that work.
Peter, you mentioned about that your neighbor should have his license taken away for running his manure spreader. So if you had your ideal, so we talked about drag lining, but say for solid manure, what's your ideal conditions to spread manure into / your ideal equipment or cover crop to spread onto, or what's your ideal for utilizing manure in your crop rotation?
Yeah, dry manure, right? Yeah. So the question, yeah, absolutely. And you're going to think that, you know, the same old song, but realistically, we want to spread it when we're not compacting, right? When does the soil tolerate heavier axle loads without compacting? When it's dry. And so when do we generally get an opportunity when the soil is dry? It's in the summertime. By the way, the other side of that is that dry manure typically has a fairly high carbon to nitrogen ratio, and if you go out and put strawy horse manure on in the spring, does it provide manure to the crop, or does it take manure? Does it provide nitrogen to the crop, or does it take nitrogen away from the crop? It takes it away, absolutely. Straw takes away nitrogen. So when I'm looking at dry manure, I'd like to have some breakdown time, so rather than spring application or whatever. So I'm going to do it after my wheat comes off, or as much as I can early in the fall to give it that breakdown time when the soil is dry. The lighter the equipment, the better. But I'm like, gosh, field like efficiency and labor, we're just all going to run big equipment. So if it's dry and you can, you know, get it done when it has that breakdown time. And you mentioned cover crop. Yeah, absolutely. I want some oats there. Red clover if I can get it. Funny, I don't want just radish there, because radish does not transfer it well to the corn crop. That nitrogen, it picks it up, it dumps it too early, and that doesn't work so well. So I think your cover crop, you look at what's going to dump that nitrogen, what's going to tie it up, and then dump it for next year's crop, right? So hopefully that answers the question.
Last one here.
Yep.
Peter, I listen to your speeches quite often, and I like them very much. But the question is, how are we going to get our crops off and in the field without compacting our fields? Because like this last fall was pretty wet. So if I go by my compaction, I still would have all my corn outside yet. So,
and that's probably okay for you, Bert, because you have enough money that if you didn't have it in the bins, it'd be okay.
no, but I'm just wondering how that's supposed to,
Yeah.
There should be some kind of, then I guess we have to be taught this better, but I don't know how.
No, so I think you live within the practical realities, and you're 100% right. And so do what you can. I mean, when you're coming out of the field. So it's interesting, because since we've started talking about this, some of the growers come up to me and say, yeah, my custom combine operator, I had to just about smack him upside the head because he had some 20-year-old kid, no offense to 20-year-old kids, but he had some 20-year-old kid that just loved driving combine, and he would drive anywhere in that field. So trying as much as you can to limit your, in the field, if you're coming out with the buggy, stay on the same track. And yeah, that one track is going to be like Tim's sweet corn where they come out every time, but at least it's only one track. And hopefully we can do something with that. You got to get the crop out of the field. I hear you on that. I don't have all the answers. I will say that this, get as big a footprint as you can. Look at the back tire. That steering axle stuff caught everybody by surprise. We are not getting, on most combines, enough rubber under the back axle. So get as much as you can there. Go to tracks on your buggy. I really think that tracks probably, because they get long and aren't as wide. We ran a tracked, and you've got to be really careful because we ran it at the very end. But the tracked buggy with 1,500 bushels of grain in it didn't look horrid. It was still too much, but it didn't look horrid. Either that or have your grain buggy with 3 axles and those Italian steering axles so that it doesn't tear everything up. Like, get enough axles underneath. Other than that, and on-the-go air inflation systems, I really think that because on the road, not so much with the combine, but with a lot of things, on the road you want high pressure, in the field you want low pressure. There's no perfect answer, but I think you have to do what you can. I really think we have to start paying attention to it, and I don't think we've been paying nearly enough attention to it. With that, I've talked way too long. I do feel for you, Bert. If you come and listen to me often enough, I really feel sorry for you. But in any case, thank you very much for having me back again, and grow good crops.